Hi, everybody. It's great to have everyone here. I know we're getting towards the end of the conference. It was excellent. I was having too much fun at lunch and almost almost overstepped. So yeah, I'm Dr. Teale Phelps Bondaroff, he, him, and I'm the research coordinator for the BC Humanist Association. And I'm joining you here on the traditional territories of the Wasanic and the Kwangwan speaking peoples. And today's panel is exploring legislative prayer in Canada. A little bit about the BC Humanist Association. So since 1984, we've been providing a community and a voice for humanists, atheists, agnostics, and non-religious in British Columbia and Canada. And we're a registered charitable organization, and we promote progressive and secular values, and we challenge religious privilege. So we have an amazing research team. We have volunteers and staff, and we work on a wide range of issues. We produce peer-reviewed content along with NGO reports and research that helps inform our advocacy efforts. And right now we're working on a wide range of subjects. We just had a report come out this week on tax policy, looking at clergy residency, tax deductions. We have work going on crisis pregnancy centers, on medical assistance in dying, conversion therapy, and legislative prayer, which is our topic for today. And so today we're joined by some amazing BCHA research team members. We got Adriana Thom, who's our researcher, and she'll be presenting on prayer in municipal councils in Canada. We have Ian Bushfield, who's our executive director, and he's going to be speaking about the broader challenges around legislative prayer and efforts to reform the practice, especially here in BC. Katie Marshall, Dr. Katie Marshall is going to be joining us to speak about, she's a board member for the BCHA, and she'll be providing an update of our quantitative analysis of legislative prayer in the BC legislature. And then Ranil Prasad, one of our colleagues, he wasn't able to make it today, so I will be covering his paper, which provides a broader introduction to legislative prayer in Canada. So I'm going to segue nicely, and since this presentation was the first one, I'm going to segue nicely into to that part of the presentation. And yeah, we're looking forward to your questions. So first of all, what is legislative prayer? It probably goes without saying, but it's starting or including prayer in a legislative session or a legislative meeting. It could be a prayer or a religious invocation. And it's quite a common practice. We see it in the Westminster model of government, and it dates back to 1558 under the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. And in the UK, they first hired official chaplains in 1659. And in the UK, this practice continues. And what's interesting about it there is that members of the public are not present when the prayer is delivered. So it's considered a private practice for members. And I just wanted to provide some international context because we do have an international crowd. In the United States, there are Senate and House chaplains, and there is an official chaplain. These people have always been Christian. They've always been male. However, they do have guest chaplains deliver their prayers at times. The first woman delivered a prayer in 1965, the first Muslim in 1992, the first Hindu in 2007. And these are cushy jobs. It's a full-time position with staff. And in 2018, the Senate chaplain was paid $172,500 USD. So I would reckon that's not a bad job if you can get it. So in Canada, we've had legislative prayer in the at the federal level since 1877. There are the Senate and the Commons start with a prayer. It's a set prayer. It's a standard prayer that's read by the speaker, and it's followed by time for reflection. It's non-denominational, using air quotes for those who are listening at home, but it's definitely religious in nature, and it invokes the religious traditions of Christianity predominantly. And there's French and English versions available, of course. And there's actually considerable diversity of practice for legislative prayer across Canada at provincial and territory legislatures. So I was going to briefly survey that just to provide some context. New Brunswick, PEI, and Ontario all open with the Lord's Prayer. This is a Christian prayer for those who aren't familiar with. I'm sure most of you are. And in Ontario, after some controversy in 2008, when they were trying to remove the prayer, they now have a compromise wherein their legislature starts with the Lord's Prayer and then a rotating list of prayers from other major faith traditions: an Indigenous prayer, Buddhism, Baha'i, Muslim, Jewish, and Sikhism. In Nova Scotia, they have the Lord's Prayer, but a slightly modified version that was shortened by one of the speakers a few years ago because I'm sure he had his reasons. In Alberta, the speaker reads a prayer of their own devising. So the current speaker reads the prayer that's in the UK legislature. The previous one under the Notley government, they were reading a rotating list of 4 or 5 prayers of their own devising. And what's interesting about Alberta is those prayers are Hansardized, which means they are recorded in the transcript of the legislature. Most legislatures do not Hansardize the prayer, again, reflecting sort of the private nature of the prayer itself. In Saskatchewan and Manitoba, there's a standard non-denominational prayer that's read by the speaker. And in the Yukon, the speaker reads one of 4 standard prayers. They have a rotating list. Quebec does not begin with a prayer. It begins with a moment of reflection, but it did begin with a prayer up until 1976 when the practice was abolished. And in Newfoundland and Labrador, they have never opened with a prayer. Now, the three groups that are missing there were Nunavut, Northwest Territories, and British Columbia. And these three legislatures all opened with a prayer of the invite an MLA, a member of the Legislative Assembly, to deliver a prayer of their own devising. And sometimes there's some drumming in Nunavut and Northwest Territories. What this did is it gave us a unique opportunity to study legislative prayer in British Columbia, because you have quite literally a smorgasbord of people delivering whatever prayer they'd like, and those people being elected officials. So the BC Humanist Association set out to study the prayer in the BC legislature in more depth. And so what we did, again, because it's not Hansardized, we had to rely on audio recordings. And so we had a team of 52 volunteers transcribe every prayer from October 6, 2002 to the present, which was at the time a year and a half ago. And that it totaled 877 prayers. And so I'm going to report a little bit here on the summary findings of this study, because Katie will be speaking about an update and how this the content of prayers has changed. And so there's two kinds of prayers in the BC legislature. There are throne prayers, or what we call throne prayers. And these are prayers that are delivered on the day when a speech from the throne is taking place. We have 23 of those, and it's quite easy to identify the religion of those, because the guest that's invited to deliver them typically has a religious affiliation or is an Indigenous elder. And on other days, all other days, a member of the Legislative Assembly delivers a prayer of their choice. They can either say whatever they like, or they can read one of, at this point, 5 sample prayers from a list. And sometimes they would mix and match. So what we did is we transcribed all these prayers. We then coded them for a number of criteria. We had 2 coders coding all of the prayers, with a third coder checking for discrepancies and ensuring intercoder reliability. And we then published these studies in the House of Prayers study. And I can pop a link to that in the chat. And I'm not going to go into that in any depth today, because it is a 130-page plus report. But I do want to sort of summarize some of the findings, because it does speak to Katie's report and provide some good context for her. But overall, we found that fewer MLAs were delivering prayers, and that the prayers were getting longer and becoming more religious. And just to jump into that just a little bit for some additional context, we found that 71.2% of the prayers were religious in nature. And where we were able to identify the religion of those prayers in 21.7% of the time. When we could identify the religion, it was 93% of the time Christian. So overtly Christian prayers represented 20.2% of all prayers. But we did have a very conservative coding system. So a lot of the prayers were coded as sectarian, where we just couldn't identify or non-sectarian, where we couldn't identify the religion, but they were overtly religious. And one thing we noticed that was very interesting was that even prayers that we coded as secular still ended in amen. There was a lot of pressure by individuals delivering prayers to make them fit the structure of a prayer, even if they were reading a poem or thanking the government for shipping shipping contracts. 88.7% of secular prayers still ended in amen, and 53% of prayers included the name of a deity. I will pause here for a moment just to explain the British Columbia legislature, because it does provide important context for our subsequent presenters, insofar as it has 2 major parties, the Liberals and the NDP. The NDPs are our left-leaning party, the Liberals are our right-leaning party. We do have a Green Party that has a couple of seats from time to time, but they were too small of a sample, so we excluded them from our analysis. And we did do a lot of analysis on religiosity and content around the parties, because they are kind of a very sort of overt left-right split. We did find, however, that both parties, their prayers are becoming more sectarian, so more religious over time. And we found, and this kind of gives you a flavor of what the parties are like. The Liberals were more likely to deliver Christian prayers, 25.4% of the time, compared to New Democrats, which was 9.2%. Just a couple other last points on the content of the prayers. Only 6% of them had Indigenous content, but we did notice that the amount of Indigenous content has been gradually increasing. And this is obviously important in a time of truth and reconciliation. 10 prayers had overtly partisan content. So during one of the prayers, the MLA took time out of their busy prayer schedule to threaten a union. And we also had one that thanked God for shipping contracts. Those were 2 that quite stood out in our minds as overtly partisan. Nothing like a backbencher trying to squeeze in a few extra swipes at the opposition during the time when they're supposed to be praising a religious figure. And as I mentioned before, you have sample prayers or prayers of their own devising. And we found that MLAs use the sample prayers about 50% of the time, or actually almost exactly 50% of the time, but that was declining over time. And overall, as I said before, prayers were getting longer. Religious prayers are more likely to be longer. So as I said, while Christian prayers represented 20.2% of all the prayers, they did represent 25.6% of all the words. And also the number of people in participating was going down. We found that fewer and fewer MLAs were actually participating, and we had a couple MLAs that were participating very much, quite a lot. So the reason that our report, the House of Prayers report, where these results are properly detailed, was part of an ongoing process by the clerk of the BC legislature to review the practice of prayers in the BC legislature. So we submitted our report as part of that process. And since that time, there have been several updates. So the BC legislature has actually changed its policies and procedures around prayer. So what we're going to go to next is Ian will be exploring how this process was updated and some of the challenges that the clerk faced in trying to evaluate how do you expand the sample list and how do prayers change. Katie will be exploring how these changes impacted the content, religiosity, and other factors. Basically, we repeated our analysis with a new set of data looking at prayers after changes were made. But before we do, I wanted to sort of talk about broadly the issue of legislative prayer in Canada. And it's actually part of a broader controversy that arises from time to time, and it goes back quite a ways. Back in 1969, when Elmer Sofa, a provincial member of Parliament for Ontario, or MPP, objected to the practice. In 2008, we had Dalton McGuinty, the Premier of Ontario, trying to review the practice as well. 2001, there was an effort to change legislative prayer in Nova Scotia. 2016 and 2018 in Saskatchewan, the Centre for Inquiry in Regina challenged the practice. And then two Green MLAs tried to challenge the practice in New Brunswick. So these have all taken place at the legislative level, at the provincial legislature level, that is. And that issue hasn't yet to reach the courts. And it's often suggested that it's protected by parliamentary privilege, which I think is something that's waiting to be seen to be challenged in the courts. However, at the municipal level, there's been a definitive ruling in the form of the Saguenay decision, which determines that it is not okay to have prayer at opening a municipal council meeting. So with that, I'm going to pass the next presentation on to Adriana, who is going to talk a bit more about that aspect of prayer at municipal council meetings, its consequences of the Saguenay decision, and some of the questions around whether there's compliance.
Hi, my name is Adriana. I use she, her pronouns, and today I will be coming to you from the territory of the Lekwungen peoples. So today I will be discussing the occurrence of prayers in municipal council meetings across Canada, as well as the impact that the Supreme Court case of Saguenay has had on this. So what happened with Saguenay? So previously in Saguenay, Quebec, municipal council meetings were opened with the recitation of prayer. This practice, along with the presence of other religious iconography in the council chamber, made a citizen of Saguenay, Mr. Simoneau, uncomfortable. So he asked the council to stop. Unfortunately, the council refused to do so. So with the assistance of a nonprofit in Quebec, this case made its way through the court system and eventually ended up in the Supreme Court. In 2015, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the Saguenay Municipal Council had breached their duty of neutrality and that Mr. Simoneau's rights had been impaired. So a little on what this means, as well as the implications of this. So Saguenay ruled that the state has a duty of religious neutrality, and that true neutrality means that they can neither favor nor hinder one religion over another. Therefore, the state must abstain from partaking in any religious practices. Now, obviously, the state is not an actual person. Therefore, it is the duty of the elected officials, public servants, and anyone else when they are representing or acting on behalf of the state to not partake or profess in any religious practices. This therefore means that starting a municipal council meeting with prayer is prohibited. Part of this also is a means of ensuring that public spaces, such as council meetings, are comfortable for all, regardless of religious belief. And this was described as a democratic imperative to do so. So with the BCHA's kind of overall project goals and interest in this, our overall goal was to see whether or not municipalities have complied with the Saguenay ruling. As well, more specifically, we were interested in whether or not municipal councils previously had prayer, whether or not they decided to amend their practices afterwards to stop, as well as what other practices may be taking place, either alongside or as well as prayer. For our methodology, using census information, we took a list of the top 50 municipalities by population in each province or territory. We looked through the minutes, agendas, audio, videos, anything we could get our hands on of council meetings for each of them. And we noted any instances of prayer along with the practice, the prayer giver if we could, their religious affiliation if applicable. And we also noted instances of territorial acknowledgements, moments of silence, or other kind of special practices such as the singing of O Canada that may be happening. In particular, we looked at the inaugural council meeting that had occurred post-Saguenay, as well as the two most recent council meetings before Saguenay had happened. This was to kind of compare the impact that Saguenay had, as well with inaugural meetings. They tend to be more high-profile events, events where council members are sworn in, and prayer may be seen as a way to solemnize the celebration. We also looked at any 3 random regular meetings post-Saguenay, as well as any 3 random regular council meetings before Saguenay occurred, as well, in order to compare the impact that it had on prayers in regular meetings. From there, depending on the level of information and the number of municipalities available, we expanded our research to look at the rest of the province/territories municipalities, or just went until every municipality within a population above 1,000 was covered in our survey. So for some of our findings, overall, we've ended up surveying 1,251 municipalities and have found 214 instances of prayer in inaugural meetings, as well as 33 instances of prayer occurring in regular council meetings. So overall, that's about 17% of the municipalities that we have surveyed have prayer and have had prayer in their inaugural meetings since Saguenay has happened as well. About 2.6% of prayers or council meetings have had prayers in their regular meetings. The biggest of this has been Ontario with their inaugural council meeting prayer instance rate being at around 40%. As well, in prayers in regular council meetings, the largest has actually been Manitoba at around 4.13%. So just kind of a province by province breakdown. In British Columbia, we ended up surveying about 162 municipalities. We were able to cover them all. What's notable about British Columbia is that we were only able to find instances of prayer in inaugural meetings. So no councils were having prayer regularly. What's also of note is that there was a lot of kind of Indigenous content. Aside from territorial welcomes, there was also kind of prayers and kind of traditional like welcome ceremonies, etc. That kind of like blurred the lines between each other. It was hard for us to kind of classify them as one or the other. In Alberta, we've ended up serving 178 municipalities. And what's notable about Alberta in comparison to British Columbia is that we found instances of prayers in regular meetings. So these are prayers that are happening regularly every week or every other week, etc. So that was quite different in comparison to BC, where we found that didn't happen. As well, in Saskatchewan, it was very similar to Alberta. We found instances of prayer in regular meetings as well. Not too many, but yeah. In Manitoba, what was notable, besides the continued besides prayers in regular meetings on top of inaugural meetings, was kind of the open defiance that these prayers kind of had. And more specifically, the city of Winnipeg, after Saguenay was asked to stop prayers as well, and they have chosen to continue to conduct prayers since, in spite of Saguenay. As well, there's kind of that blurring between Indigenous and prayer content, where it's been hard to classify kind of what was given or said as one or the other. In Ontario, what was notable was kind of the overall high volume of prayers. That being said, there are more municipalities in Ontario, but as overall, Ontario had kind of the highest inaugural rate at around 40%. Along with prayers, a high volume of prayers, as well as an instance of prayers in regular meetings, we kind of noted something called stealth prayer. And this was kind of a practice where a lot of councils that had previously had prayer were having something take place that looked like a prayer, felt like a prayer, but officially it was not called a prayer. Kind of they'd be called like an opening or a council commitment statement, etc. And it was kind of a time for prayer, but not really. So that was something that was interesting. In Quebec, where the Saguenay case actually took place, we were not able to find any instances of prayers at all. However, what was notable was that we found more moments of silent reflection taking place instead. And just to not to neglect the Maritimes, but overall in the Maritimes so far, we have not been able to find that many instances of prayers. There's been kind of like one or two in inaugural meetings. However, what's notable is in New Brunswick, we found some practices going along that, apart from kind of prayers and minutes of silence, including reading a poem or reading a quote, etc. So that was kind of unique. As well, moving on to the territories, one of the challenges here was the lack of the small number of municipalities, the small populations of municipalities, and therefore the lack of data available, because if you have a place with a population of, like 20 people, you're probably not going to have a website. You might have a Facebook page. You might have a Yellow Pages, maybe. And there's also a smaller number of staff who are able to send you things or answer your questions. So overall, we haven't found a ton of prayers, but we also haven't been able to find a lot of information. And that's another challenge, is part of it is, if a prayer didn't take place and they don't note it down in their agenda meetings or agendas or minutes of their meetings, we can't it's hard to prove something didn't take place. So that was kind of a limitation. As well, in order to, the goal was not just to kind of like name and shame municipalities, but we want municipalities to change. We want them to discontinue the practice of prayer. So for the ones where we did find instances of them, we've been writing to them to ask them to please stop. And so far, we've kind of had a range of responses. Some of them, such as the city of Langley in British Columbia, has passed a resolution, and they've said that, yes, we will ensure that we will stop this before our next inaugural council meeting. Others have had kind of more like lukewarm responses. The District of Saanich and BC has said they'll take our comments into consideration. And some have been kind of outright negative, including the city of Winnipeg. They've kind of doubled down in the past previously, and in writing to them to kind of like get their reasoning on the decision, we were sent kind of like a blacked out email through an FOI several months later with nothing really there. So yeah, some have been not so positive. So overall, we found that municipal councils have been complying with the Saguenay ruling. I think even one municipality that has decided to change the practice is a win, so that's good. But more than that, we were able to find overall 17.1% of municipalities surveyed with, we found 17.1% of municipalities that we surveyed still have continued to hold the practice of inaugural prayer, as well as 2.3 have continued to do the practice of prayers in regular council meetings. Therefore, there's still many more that do need to comply with Saguenay, and we will be keeping our eyes on them. As well, there are also a variety of other practices taking place in municipal councils that go beyond prayer, such as territorial acknowledgements, moments of silent reflection, the singing of God Save the Queen, etc. So there's a lot of other kind of interesting things taking place to replace or alongside prayer.
Thank you so much, Adriana. Fantastic. Thank you. And great. So thank you very much. So I should say that Adriana is the person in Canada that has quite literally looked at more municipal websites than anyone else alive. And there are some really bad ones, especially when you get into municipalities with like 50 members. They don't put the effort in to make them easily readable. So lots of respect to Adriana and her amazing work on that project. So it's now my pleasure to pass the microphone proverbially over to Ian to speak a bit more about some of the challenges that legislatures face when actually trying to reform these practices. So we're moving from the municipal back to the provincial and territory level, and I'll pass it on to you, Ian.
So I'm coming to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coquitlam First Nation here just outside Metro Vancouver. Before I really get into my talk today, I want to recognize that, you know, it's been a rough couple weeks, months. I forget exactly when the discovery in Kamloops here in British Columbia of the unmarked graves at the former residential school was. Time has no meaning anymore. But I want to touch on that because our work doesn't directly address colonialism, but in our work on religious privilege, I think there is a tie-in to the Christian supremacist worldview that it really underpins colonialism as it has been experienced in Canada. And I'm hopeful that our analyses can help serve some greater purpose in reconciliation. Part of that is the paper, Decolonizing Legislative Prayer, that we're not talking about today, but it builds on this same work that we're talking about, and it looks a little bit deeper at the Indigenous content being used at the provincial legislature and challenges MLAs to do more. And I think Katie will be able to speak a little bit to whether or not that's happening. The paper I want to talk about is this Arbiters of Faith paper that developed out of our conversations with the clerk of the legislature here in BC as we were trying to figure out what the practice was and how it worked. We heard that there was this list of sample prayers that MLAs could choose from in addition to being able to just write any of their own. And this raised for us innumerable questions, particularly as we learned that the clerk was eager to revise the list to be more representative of the diversity of British Columbia. So this paper in many ways is a case study on how can bureaucrats and the judiciary intersect with religion and what challenges, both pragmatic and constitutional, does that raise? I forgot what my slides look like. So sample prayers. Here in British Columbia, each day, as Teale said, the MLA begins with a prayer and reflection. That's the updated language from prayers as it was pre-2018. The MLA can, of course, write their own, or they can choose from one of these sample prayers used by the clerk. As Teale said, 50% of MLAs from 2003 to 2019 were sample prayers. And there's this process to update this. These are the sample prayers as they existed until very recently. There were 5 here. I'm not going to read them all out, but you can see 2 of them explicitly reference God, most gracious God, and the last one, we pray to God. Another in there says we ask for divine guidance. And the other 2 are more secular in frame. They give thanks to the province or the bounty or gifts of freedom, but they all still have a very traditional Christian prayer format. They all end in amen. They're about looking to a higher power, whether supernatural or just thankful. So there was a recognition within the clerk's office itself that these prayers didn't reflect the growing diversity of religious and non-religious belief here in the province. So there was an effort to review that. And we posed our paper as a number of challenges and questions that this raises, because to revise a list of prayers really entangles the bureaucracy with religion. And I do want to emphasize that this paper is not intended to be a critique of the clerk, Caitlin Ryan Lloyd at the time, specifically, but just more generally an exploration of this. You know, we have immense respect for the clerk. She worked very well with us and appreciated, I think, most of our input most of the time, even though we had some pointed online questions as an advocacy group. But our questions here kind of just try to dig into what is the actual process that one has to go through, either explicitly or even just implicitly. Like, these questions have to be answered. So to create a list of prayers, you first have to decide what is a religion, what isn't. You have to then pick which religions you're going to include. The sample list can't include every possible prayer that's ever been written. It would be unwieldy and useless to MLAs. Once you've picked the number of religions to include, how do you decide which prayers within that religion to include? And then there was also a desire to include non-religious reflections and secular reflections. But that raises the additional problem, because atheists don't tend to have rituals in the same way that the religious do. That's obviously a discussion for many, many more papers at this conference and other conferences like it. But our point being, there's a lot of just challenges here. And each of these, we argue, requires the clerk to become the, quote, arbiter of religious dogma. So that quote comes from this seminal case from 2004, I believe, Syndicat Northcrest versus Amsalem, which is a really fascinating case about Orthodox Jewish people in a condo building, I believe in Quebec, where they wanted to put up a sukkah on their patio, and they got into a big debate with their strata over whether or not that was allowed, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court about whether refusing to allow them to erect these structures violated their religious freedom. And so Justice Iacobucci, in writing the majority decision, had to define what religion is. And our courts have been very reticent to do that. Big M Drug Mart was referenced in Corey Steele's talk earlier today. It defines religion as kind of just something every Canadian can work out. And religion in Canada has been a very personal and subjective issue. The talk earlier today comparing Argentina and Brazil, Argentina having the state-sanctioned list of religions, and Brazil just kind of taking a more open approach. Canada's definitely more on the open approach. Iacobucci here says, religion is about freely and deeply held personal convictions or beliefs connected to an individual's spiritual faith and integrally linked to one's self-definition and spiritual fulfillment. That sounds great, but I struggle to functionalize that into how a bureaucrat can decide what is a religion specifically. Like, that helps the courts in a specific claim coming forward. But if we're trying to develop a list of religions, that feels like there are as many religions in Canada as there are Canadians. And this is a problem we want to keep coming back to. Iacobucci went on in his paper and argues explicitly that the state is in no position, nor should it become, the arbiter of religious dogma. There's a misconception in the public, I think, that because Canada doesn't have the establishment clause that the US has, that we don't have a strict separation of church and state. But I think that's a misreading of the Supreme Court's decisions and of our own charter, where you have decisions like this in Saguenay, which clearly delineate the role for the state in deciding what is and isn't appropriate. So we go and we keep this in mind as we explore these different questions raised by the clerk. In the first case, so what is a religion? If we don't have a strict definition from the courts, we are left with this challenge of even figuring out what a religion is. If it's a very personal matter, we have to leave it up to every individual. Iacobucci goes on in his decision to set out a test for what is a religion, what is a religious freedom claim. He says there must be a belief or practice that has a nexus with religion, which calls for a particular line of conduct, and the person must be sincere in their belief. So there's an element of sincerity in there, which still leaves us a bit, it leaves me at least a bit confused as to how the clerk should make this decision. But let's pretend for a second that the clerk can figure out what religion is. We then have to figure out which religions to include, because the church or the state is required, as Adriana talked about, to uphold its duty of neutrality. The state can't just pick its favorite religions. It has to find some neutral basis on which, if it's going to make these decisions, to not favor anyone unjustifiably. So we did ask the clerk how she and her office planned to do this. I don't have the email in front of me, but they did get back to us, and they pointed to, for example, an existing table of precedents that is a bureaucratic document for formalities to show how dignitaries should be introduced. We couldn't find the BC one publicly available, but the federal one lists representatives of faith communities should be introduced after premiers, but before judges, senators, and members of parliament and other high-ranking government officials. But it doesn't actually have a list of who representatives of faith communities are, so it's still an open question. We actually spoke to the spokesperson from the Ministry of Canadian Heritage at the federal government, and he told me that the list is more just for event organizers to decide, what order do we introduce people? And he said on a case-by-case basis, there would be an appropriate names drawn up and invited to these events. He pointed to the Chaplain General of the Canadian Armed Forces has a list of groups they tend to work with. Other event organizers might do their own research and exclude those deemed not worthy. And he specifically referenced the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster as an example of a representative who would probably not be invited to a formal function in Canada. We found this aside amusing and fascinating because it raises a lot of different questions about how the state can make decisions about what is and isn't a religion. It's relatively trivial in our mind. I don't think anyone's too offended by which religious representatives are at the funeral of a prime minister, for example. But there are some interesting questions in there. And this also ties in, for example, to our work on the clergy residence deduction about, how does the state and the judiciary decide who is a clergy for the purposes of this tax deduction? We thought alternatively, rather than relying on bureaucratic familiarity, which is what is essentially happening, sort of who does the clerk know and what approach have they taken, or what has other elements of the state taken, we tried to present different ways the clerk's office could develop these lists of religions. Demographics seems like a simple and straightforward approach. Just kind of look at the census and see who the most popular religious identifications are. But this in turn creates a number of other issues. When you look at Canada's census, and it's been talked about many times and many will be familiar, the census is not a perfect description of what people's religious identities are. Even in Canada, we ask, what is your religious affiliation? But we ask, even if you are not currently a practicing member of that group. So a lot of non-religious Canadians get lumped in with major faith traditions. For example, in Quebec, 75% of people identify as Catholic in the 2011 census, but you can find public opinion surveys, for example, by Leger in 2019, where 28% of people say they strongly believe in God. So there are a lot of Quebecers who don't strongly believe in God, but identify as Catholic, which would seem to be a defining characteristic of Catholicism, at least in my mind. The Statistics Canada's questions has a number of other issues in that its list of identifications was quite interesting up until recently. There were 99 religious identities listed in the 2011 census, but 70 of those were different sects of Protestant Christianity, while there were no distinctions for Buddhism, Islam, or Judaism. They were just all lumped into one. So Sufi and Sunni Muslims were lumped into just the broad category as Islam, while you had various sects of Orthodox and Pentecostal Christianity divided out. Assuming we still use this list, though, we have to decide where we're going to draw the line and only include identities above that line. Presumably, the clerk would want to include Judaism based on its historical significance as a world religion. But in British Columbia, only 0.5% of people identified as Jewish. There are 16 faiths that are more populous or prominent on the list than that, with non-religion being the most declared at 43%, 44%. And there were 10 sects of Protestant Christianity in there. Perhaps the clerk could amalgamate these sects of Protestant Christianity to keep the number of prayers down, but that requires the clerk to make decisions about whether you can lump Anglicans and Pentecostals in the same prayer and whether they would appreciate that. Alternatively, the clerk could turn to the demographics of the legislature, which creates problems about the privacy of MLAs and whether the clerk should be asking them what their religious identification is to try to present prayers for them. And that also steps on the MLA's toes because they can already write their own prayers. So there shouldn't necessarily be any need for the clerk to dig into the identification of MLAs. If we go beyond the step and assume we have a list of religions we want to include in our list of prayers, the clerk then has to ask, which prayers are we going to include and how are we going to find those? And each of these raises both pragmatic and, again, constitutional questions. Because while it's easy to figure out what prayers the Catholic Church may want to include because it's a very hierarchical religion and you can just go to the senior archbishop in your region, for many non-traditional and non-hierarchical religions, it's significantly more difficult to figure out who is the spokesperson for that faith. Once again, we kind of come back to this idea that there are as many faiths as there are British Columbians, in that even within a church that is hierarchical, you can have different beliefs among the pews. We see this in public opinion survey of what Catholics believe in Canada, which is not generally in line with what the Catholic Church and the Catechism say. Catholics in Canada tend to be more supportive of abortion rights, of assisted dying, than the church officially is. Even if we did manage to find representatives, those representatives tend to be overwhelmingly male, and this creates a different equity issue where suddenly we're presenting these prayers from predominantly religious men to represent all British Columbians. This isn't just a theoretical issue. In Scotland, they invite a religious or belief system representative every week to do a time for reflection, and they found between 2016 and 2020, over 70% of those guests were men. And then we come to the question of the non-religious. 44% of British Columbians say they were non-religious in the 2011 census. When we did a survey in 2016 asking British Columbians if you practice a religion or faith, 69% said no. So somewhere between half and 2/3 or more of this province are non-religious, and finding a single spokesperson for them or finding a series of representative reflections, let's say, is incredibly tough. The BC Humanist Association likes to bill ourselves as the voice for the humanists and the non-religious, but obviously we can't be all things to all people. So we're just one voice in this realm. And so while we were solicited for submissions, and we did provide some, ultimately we said, this practice undermines what many non-religious people see as the proper forum for the state. So our ultimate recommendation was that if this practice is to continue, MLAs have the resources and the authority to make these decisions themselves. They can write prayers and they can do them themselves. Unfortunately, the clerk didn't take our recommendation. She did draft up a number of different prayers. I will see if I can actually switch. I found it in my screen that I can show you what the prayers ended up being. So there's a larger list now Ignore the numbers along the side. There are 5 that are largely similar to the previous ones. And then there is a traditional land acknowledgement, a Buddhist prayer, a Christian prayer, a Hindu Gayatri mantra, a Jewish prayer, a Muslim prayer, and a Sikh prayer. I'm not going to speak to any of those faith traditions and decide whether these are appropriate or not, but it's interesting to see the number grow. And I believe in our future research, we're going to be trying to figure out whether these get used more or not. And I think it'll be quite interesting to see whether some of the more or the less prominent religions in BC are represented and used by MLAs, or whether MLAs increasingly choose to draft their own prayers and reflections. So I'll turn it back to Teale at this point.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Ian. And so segueing beautifully into our next presenter, Katie, who will be speaking to whether there was changes in the delivery, content, religiosity of prayers as a result of the changes that Ian was mentioning. So I'll pass on to Katie here to elaborate on some of the impacts of those changes.
All right, great. And I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so I'm coming to you today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And I just want to sort of acknowledge that I come into this talk wearing 2 hats. The first hat is my work as a board member of the BC Humanist Association. And my second hat is my quantitative skills that come actually from my background as a zoologist. So I'm not a political scientist, I'm not a sociologist. And so questions around sort of more of the political science nature of the work, I'd really ask you to direct to other members of our team. I just ran the numbers. That said, one of the things that I was really interested in this analysis was some of the roles that gender played in the way that sort of religiosity was used within the BC legislature. And so I find these questions really interesting. I don't have the theoretical background. So if you find this interesting, or interested in collaborating with Teale and I on some of these questions, please get in touch. I think there's a lot of interesting questions that could be asked there. Okay, so the questions that we wanted to address with this analysis, and so this is all the prayers used by MLAs within the British Columbia legislature, included questions around how religious, so how many of these prayers and reflections were actually contained religious content. And I was also really interested in some of the drivers of prayer and reflection, religiosity, and length. So do we see sort of interactions amongst party affiliation and gender on what prayers were given? And then finally, how have these changed over time? So do we see, there's been a lot of discussion about increased secularization amongst people in British Columbia. Did the switch to prayers and reflections, so that that sort of policy switch that Teale talked about early on, did that affect some of our answers? And really just sort of how are things progressing in that sort of time context? Okay, so including the most recent update, so up to 2020, we looked at a total of 974 prayers given by 134 separate MLAs. So these are members of the Legislative Assembly. And I just wanted to remind you a little bit about some of the categories that we found that Teale talked about. So there were some that we really didn't know if they were religious or not. They were delivered entirely in a non-English language. So we really couldn't figure out what the religious content of those prayers were. 19 of these prayers and reflections were not a prayer, so something like a poem, and 268 were secular. So these were things that had no explicit religious language at all. Now, in sort of yellowy orange here, I've highlighted the ones that contained religious language. Most of those were non-sectarian. We couldn't pin it down to which particular religion the prayer was actually invoking, and 210 of these were explicitly sectarian. So, words like Heavenly Father, which would indicate generally a Christian prayer. And I also want to point out that even though we did have a large number, so 27.6% of all the prayers were considered secular, most of these actually, so over 86% of these finished with the word amen. So even though we considered them secular, they did contain the language of an Abrahamic religion. So for the most part, we're seeing a large number of these prayers were actually prayers and reflections were actually quite religious in nature. So getting on to question 2, what are some of the drivers of these prayer and reflection, religiosity, and length? And I just want to remind you, we have 2 major political parties at the provincial level in British Columbia. We excluded 2 prayers that were given by independent MLAs, just because we can't really do these analyses very well with only 2, and also by Green MLAs, which only delivered a total of 3 of these. So all of these comparisons are going to compare the Liberal Party, which is our more right-wing party within BC, and the NDP, which is our more left-leaning party. And so first off, I just want to start by looking at the number of prayers that were sectarian. So this is kind of our most explicitly sort of religious category, and we know which religion it has to do with. And so I was interested in how, you know, do men or women tend to give more religious prayers, and does this depend on the party affiliation of the MLA? And what we found was generally liberal MLAs were more likely to deliver a prayer that was explicitly sectarian, and also male MLAs were more likely to deliver a prayer that was explicitly sectarian. And there was no, and this was to sort of equal quantity. So both liberal and male MLAs were more likely to give sectarian prayers. And so that was something that we were a little bit surprised by, but was really clear from our data. Now, on the secular side of things, so I wanted to look at prayers that were explicitly non-religious. So here we have proportion secular on the y-axis, gender, male and female on the right. And here we see something a little bit different. So the NDP were more likely to deliver explicitly secular prayers. Women in the NDP were more likely to give secular prayers as well. And whereas amongst liberal MLAs, women were slightly more likely to deliver secular prayers, but to a much lesser extent than within the NDP. So there's this, the effect of party affiliation really depended on which gender the MLA was actually of. So it was really fascinating. Secondly, we wanted to look at the length of these prayers. And so we quantified length by word count. I recognize that's imperfect, but it is sort of a nice quantitative way to look at rough changes in length. And so here on the x-axis, we have whether they were secular, 1 meaning yes, 0 meaning no. And we have the length of the prayer in words on the y-axis here. And so what was really interesting here is that among liberal MLAs, if they delivered a non-religious prayer, it was significantly shorter by almost 50% than if they gave an explicitly religious prayer. Now, this effect was still there amongst NDP MLAs, but it was attenuated. So they're not non-religious prayers, or their secular prayers were shorter, but not by a whole lot compared to their religious prayers. However, this also interacted with the gender of the MLA. So in general, NDP MLAs, female MLAs amongst the NDP generally gave longer prayers. And remember, these were also more likely to be secular. And but male MLAs amongst the NDP gave slightly shorter prayers in general. In the Liberal Party, this was actually flipped. So male MLAs were likely to give longer prayers than female MLAs. And remember, these were also more likely to be religious. So there's this 3-way interaction. In short, the length of the prayer depended not only on gender, political party, and whether or not the prayer was secular, but all of those terms drove the length amongst each other. There was this interaction between them, which I found really, really fascinating. Now, finally, we were interested in how prayers changed over time. And so do we see any movement towards increased secularism? Has been sort of suggested with time. And so here on the y-axis, I have the proportion of prayers that were explicitly sectarian. So not only were they religious, but we knew which religion they were affiliated with. And I should mention the sectarian prayers were overwhelmingly Christian. So here we have men and women plotted separately, so men in red and women in blue. And you can see along the x-axis here, we have religion over time. And what's sort of fascinating to me is that the proportion sectarian significantly declined through the 2000s up until 2010. And then we actually saw the male MLAs giving significantly more sectarian prayers over time. So becoming more and more sectarian as time passes. Where the female MLAs, it just sort of bottomed out at that same low level in 2010 and really didn't change over time. I also plotted here just an arrow indicating when the change from prayers to prayers and reflections in the legislature came. And you can see that it really just seemed to suggest that trends were kind of continuing the way they were. There wasn't sort of a massive change that had happened. The other thing I want to point out is that there was, of course, a party difference here. So as in before, Liberal Party was much more likely to have sectarian prayers. And, but again, this seemed to increase over time from 2010 onwards. So this was really surprising to us. We thought we would have just sort of seen a decrease over time, but it really seems that there's not only a gender difference in this, there's also a party difference. And finally, also these prayers are getting longer over time. So again, around 2010, we're seeing this increase in length. And of course, this is driven by, we think, the increased sectarian nature of prayers after 2010. And again, maybe a little drop off in 2020 after the change to prayers and reflections, but nothing that's really sort of a massive drop. What is interesting is that the proportion of prayers that end in amen used to almost always be 100%. You can see actually from the mid 2010s that this number was changing over time, and we did see this sort of continuation into 2020. Again, not a massive change after the change in language use, but suggesting that the continuation of this trend in reduction of amen. The last thing I wanted to just sort of touch on is that Indigenous language use, so sometimes the use of particular Indigenous words or land acknowledgements, has significantly increased over time in the BC legislature. Now about 10 to 12% of all of these prayers and reflections do include some use or acknowledgement of Indigenous language. And so this has been a small change over time. Okay, so just to sum up our analytical questions. So generally, how religious are the prayers and reflections given by British Columbian MLAs? They're generally more religious overall and more Abrahamic than British Columbians as a whole. What are some of the drivers of these prayer and reflection religiosity and length? Male liberals generally give more religious prayers, and they're generally longer, but only if given by liberal MLAs. Now, one thing I do want to mention with all of this is that amongst MLAs who gave prayers and reflections, there were actually, in the NDP party, women were much closer to parity than they were in the Liberals. So amongst the NDP, it was close to 50-50. Amongst the Liberals, it was about 25% of all of their MLAs were women. So the women in the NDP generally give longer prayers, but they are also usually more secular. And again, it's, you know, the party affiliation and gender balance are sort of entangled with each other. So it's a little bit complicated here. And so it is hard to disentangle these gender and party effects a little bit. So how have these two questions changed over time? Did the switch to prayers and reflections change the answers to 1 and 2? Well, men are generally giving more religious prayers over time, which I found really surprising. Liberals are giving more religious prayers. And these prayers are getting longer. However, amen is disappearing. So a little bit of sort of movement towards secularity there. So major takeaways. So far, it really doesn't seem that the change to prayers and reflections meaningfully change the religiosity of prayers, but it may take some more time to see this change. The less religiosity by women was a little unexpected for me, but I found it really interesting. And prayers in the BC legislature are generally becoming more religious and longer over time, despite dropping the amen at the end. That's it for me. Thank you so much, everyone, and look forward to some more discussion around this.
Thank you so much, Katie. So I just want to remind folks so they can put their questions in the chat or stand by for questions. But before we do have our amazing discussant, Solange Lefebvre from Université Montréal. So I'm going to pass on to Solange to provide some response / discussion on the broader issue. So Solange, you have the floor.
Well, thanks so much. Hello, everyone. I was quite excited when I got the invitation to react to these presentations. Thanks to Dr. Teale Phelps for having sent me their papers. So first, allow me to situate myself. I was quite surprised years ago to learn that there were prayers in the political arena, but not opposed. Actually, I did not know much about these prayers. I was appointed as an expert for 2 cases regarding prayers at the opening of a municipal assembly in Quebec, in Laval first, north of Montreal, and in Saguenay, the famous Saguenay case that was presented at the beginning. It was in 2009, at the beginning of the case. So, and I was invited as an expert of contemporary religion in Canada. So the Saguenay case went to the Supreme Court, and as it was said, a very clear and strong definition of state neutrality was elaborated. Through these cases, I learned a little bit more about the prayers, but not much overall. A general literature was lacking on the topic. The truth is that we don't know much about religious or spiritual practices in the public arena, maybe because they are part of a tradition, unwritten sometimes, not public, simply there. That's how it is done, and we don't know exactly why. This is the most basic definition of a tradition. They are performed in the public arena, but are mostly unknown to the public until a complaint reveals and questions them, or an association like the Humanist Association. As an expert, I got access to some descriptions and to some testimonies in court, but very limited still. I kept telling myself that a deep study of these practices would be useful and interesting, including the persons involved in the practice itself, who endorsed or respected them in some ways, and the persons that felt discriminated, marginalized by them, opposed them. Yet the context of the 2 cases were offering limited possibilities to do so. You may know how a judicial context is built, making nuances and deep reflections quite difficult. The objective being to render a final and clear decision, yes or no. When you participate to a trial and you read later the text of the final judgment, you are exposed to a radically different world or perspective. What was experienced in court is not necessarily reflected in the judgment. This is not surprising, since the judge deals with the totality of the elements, while the different actors are involved in just small pieces of the trial, especially the experts. So when I was asked to give an opinion, the question that was asked to me was very narrow and technical. What was the extent of the discrimination? What was the depth of the effects on the persons? It was a matter of jurisdiction. It was a prayer to the Lord, Seigneur, to God. It was not the Lord's prayer. It could be considered as sectarian, that's the discussion, but it could be not considered as a sectarian. The cases had been submitted to the Commission of Rights. It's good to know, okay? And not to the Federal Superior Court. Therefore, the lawyers explained to me I could not address the question of the neutrality of the state, but only the extent of discrimination. So I don't want to, I'll skip a few things I had written because we have to get to the discussion. So since detailed studies of these practices of prayer are missing, the kind of work you are doing in BC, the association that just presented these very interesting papers, is very useful. The quantitative approach is quite impressive and instructive, but do not forget that we need to hear the personal stories. You know, the depth of the discrimination. How is it felt and lived? The questions I would ask to my colleagues humanists in this actual context of debates are the following. Even if we can trace Christian prayers in North America to the 17th, 18th century, the literature on antiquity and ancient times tend to show that prayers, invocations, and ritual settings were frequent in the locations of power. Scholars often speak about a deep structural lean towards the reproduction and adaptation of these ancient religious expressions until today. It is more obvious in Europe, where you find several layers of pagan traditions behind Christian ones, even layers that have been forgotten, like the research on Egyptian religions show. Therefore, what would be the need behind these practices? And hearing your presentations, you were talking about a lot of different practices, sectarian prayers, invocations, poems. So I said, what do they think? Can we still ask that kind of question in the secular age? What are the needs behind these prayers or some sorts of invocations or poems or etc.? Why do human beings created them? Of course, the theories of power and sacredness offer fundamental answers to that question, but it is not enough. A student of mine, Mathieu Collin, was presenting at this actual conference. He's making me work very hard these days because I have to read his PhD on the Satanic Temple, this non-theistic and secularist group that fights for equality in the USA in many ways. Satan, by the way, is not a creature for them, but a rationalistic symbolic figure. Mathieu explains in the last part of his PhD how the group changed from a fight for secularism to a fight for pluralism, even suggestion that a decision to replace a prayer by a moment of silence in order to block the way to the Satanic Temple getting their invocation heard at a municipal council left some of the Satanic Temple members ambivalent. They would have loved to do this actual invocation of their temple. After all, what's best? A theistic prayer? I would exclude a sectarian prayer in our context. You are certainly not right. A moment of silence, a pluralistic moment where many kinds of invocations can be heard, or nothing. Adriana was saying that there were several kinds of opening moments. Katie as well. She was speaking about a secular prayer. I would like to know more. Women were pronouncing. How do you define them? Can religious diversity be really managed and represented in the public arena or not? I'm asking this because in Quebec, when we're facing several convictions, that's when we're getting to none in the public arena or moment of silence. So I leave you the questions. What is your view on this particular moment if we, as the Supreme Court asked, stop doing prayers, sectarian or non-sectarian prayers? Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Fascinating papers.
Thank you so much for your comments and questions. So I'm going to open it to the panel to answer those questions. I'm a co-author in all these papers, so I'm keen to answer them as well, but recognizing that I am quite verbose, I'll maybe open it to the rest of my colleagues to respond. Maybe we can tackle the questions in turn. I hope everyone caught all of them. But yeah, I think maybe speaking about what is the need behind these kinds of practices might be a good place to start. Or Ian, you want to go ahead? So yeah, Ian.
Yeah, I just unmuted myself, but I'm happy to talk to any of them. I'm definitely not eager to speak over Adriana or Katie if they have anything they want to add. So definitely jump in if I don't touch it. As the executive director of the BC Humanist Association, I have sort of two hats here, right? I have my academic as a presenter, where we are trying to do things in a rigorous manner that can be respected and peer-reviewed and published. But we're also an advocacy organization, so we have clear views on many of these questions. The idea, so first I'll tackle secular prayers in our context. That one's tricky because we were faced with, particularly when we started our study, the time period in the legislature was defined as a prayer. And yet we were finding MLAs doing things that weren't prayers, or were doing things that looked like a prayer but didn't involve any religious language or approaches. And so that's what we kind of slotted in there. So it's not language we would probably have used. We can call them reflections now, but we had poems. We had people reading both their own poetry or ones that they took from public sources where we could find it. Some really interesting things. I think one MLA referenced a poem about farming. There were some interesting religious prayers as well. A couple of BC Liberal MLAs would pray for a shipbuilding contract. One brought in a prayer about, they were in the midst of a labor dispute and they were hoping the union would see the light of God or something like that. So MLAs on very rare occasions would use some that time for interesting approaches. There was, and I won't just pick on the BC Liberals, the Greens didn't have too many, but there were a couple weird NDP ones that were a bit more granola, let's say. But this idea of ritual is a really interesting one, especially for a humanist association. We struggle with it because we both recognize on the one hand that ritual is an innate human attribute, something we seek, and it's why people come to our organization. And in many provinces, humanist officiants perform weddings we're not allowed to here in BC, but people at end of life, for example, will seek different kinds of ceremonies, and I know there's much work going on that. So what is the right ritual for the state to sanction an official event that is reflective of a pluralistic society? I don't think we've come to a good answer around that question. I would argue Indigenous land acknowledgements are becoming a ritual in British Columbia, are probably for the better, but as Jonathan talked about earlier, there's a lot of skepticism about whether that's a sincere or just performative aspect. And I hope, each of us did provide our own as we were speaking, but I'm hoping that our work does do more than just the performative. I think the Satanic Temple is a fantastic example of a challenging approach to it. Canadian law is very cynical or skeptical of satirical type religions, or whatever you would classify the Satanic Temple as. Cases with the Flying Spaghetti Monster. There was a case of the Church of Atheism that I referenced in Arbiters, where people try to fit non-religious worldviews into the box of religion in our law, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. For example, the clergy residence deduction, I'm pretty sure I couldn't get it despite working an administrative function in a organization that does a lot of things like a religion would, but I would sure like to take a third of my taxes off, which a clergy member can do. But I'll turn it over. That was a little bit snarky, but these are interesting questions, right? These are interesting questions, and it kind of touches through all of this, but I'll turn it over to Katie or Adriana if you want to add anything.
Sure. I mean, it's sort of interesting. Before this panel started, Vanessa and I were talking a little bit. This came up as well in the previous session we were in, about the sort of intersections between culture and religion, and how can you really separate the two, that often they are things that intersect with each other and are hard to, or grade into each other, right? So one of the things that why we have these prayers, I think, is because as humans we feel the need to solemnize a particular, what we're about to do, and I think that's important. Like, I am all for when politicians sit down to make major decisions, right? A reminder of the importance of what they're doing, I think is actually really important. So I think that there is a deep Christian history of making these kinds of sort of doing that, performing that ritual need, right? Like a reminder of the importance of what's about to happen by marking it with a prayer. I mean, I grew up in a family that had a Christian prayer before every meal, right? And again, the purpose of that was a reminder of the importance of that meal and to be thankful for the food we were about to eat. Those are not bad things. Those are actually very secular needs, I think. They're not necessarily a religious need, but they're marked by a religious use. And so I think prayer in the Legislative Assembly has sort of a similar function, so a non-religious function, but that is sort of filled by religion. So where to go? Well, if the need itself is not religious, then presumably the way that need is filled could be non-religious as well. So that's just my 2 cents on it. And again, with the caveats that I'm a scientist and not a sociologist, but thanks.
Adriana, did you want to mention anything on the municipal context? I had a few comments as well.
Yeah, just disclaimer, I am not this is kind of like my first year of looking at kind of like prayers and legislative prayers and religion and all that. So I'm not super well versed in all this, but I think something that really stood out to me was kind of the idea of, you know, like what is the actual impact that, you know, that the practice of prayer does have on people. And, you know, like, because obviously like kind of like our methodology has been kind of very like, is there a prayer in the agenda? Yes. Okay, they have prayers, move on. And I guess I'm kind of thinking now, as we continue to write the reports for the rest of the provinces, how can we kind of like integrate, I guess, more kind of personal experiences, because ultimately like that's what it comes down to is, you know, people and people feeling comfortable and feeling like they're able to kind of like express that. As well, I'm just kind of thinking about like how do we achieve representation and make, you know, people feel comfortable and celebrate diversity. In the case of kind of like religion, Saguenay has kind of been the first one where there's kind of been an overt declaration that, you know, the best way to achieve kind of true neutrality, religious neutrality, is to abstain completely. It's kind of the first of its kind. And looking at another case, the Port Alberni case, where that kind of pertained to whether or not a smudging ceremony demonstration in a school was a violation of someone's religious freedom. And one thing the justice kind of noted in that was, you know, like what are the limits of, you know, the Saguenay case, and, you know, how do we promote kind of, how do we, you know, promote neutrality, but also promote religious diversity? Because, you know, a lot of within Canadian history, kind of the idea, there was kind of like the two kind of dominant sects of religion were like Catholicism and Protestantism. And now in this day and age, we see kind of like growth in other religions that kind of go beyond Christianity. So I guess kind of, I don't have anything necessarily concrete, but it's made me think, you know, like how do we, you know, promote diversity and neutrality and all that? Because, you know, in other cases, such as, you know, like when it comes to like race, you know, like affirmative action and, you know, actions that kind of like in instances that like kind of clearly highlight and promote that are seen more, I guess, like as a positive. So I guess that's kind of my interest. Those are things I'm thinking.
Oh, no, thanks, Adriana. I just to build on that a little bit, one of the examples that came up and that Adriana really touched on this, I think really astutely, which is that idea of the tension between like what is a cultural or religious practice. And I know Lori talks about this in her recent book. You know, so is, for example, I live here in Saanich, and our municipal council meeting opened with a traditional Indigenous welcome. But it was delivered in Wasonic, and I don't speak Wasonic, but I did hear the word Jesus mentioned about 3 or 4 times. And so you have a deeply religious presentation that's also part of a traditional welcome. And so that's something that we're going to be exploring moving forward in our research, is how do you address those kinds of tensions? Where is that line drawn? It may be very difficult to draw. I want to touch on just a couple of Solange's questions before we open up the floor. I did see one in the chat, so, but do please raise your hands if you're interested in asking a question here. I think overall, the Satanic Temple presents us with an interesting, like two-forked approach, if I may be so bold, which is that you have ultimately the one of, you know, we want to have a neutral space, but if it's not going to be a neutral space, we'd like to be presenting to as well, please. And I think that it highlights the tension of having these religious practices. And this is really what really comes out in Ian's presentation, which is if you're going to open up the space, by the space, I mean the political space, to all religions, you have to have a definition of religion. And of course, we don't have one in Canada that's functional, so that's a problem. And then if you're going to open up to all religions, then why not other groups? So what we actually saw in Scotland, which seems to be the compromise solution, is they invite guests to deliver all of the invocations or presentations at the beginning of their sessions, and those actually reflect the demographic breakdown of their jurisdiction. Now, as Ian mentioned, it doesn't reflect the gender balance, but you did have actually a humanist, giving it a presentation in BSL, in sign language, British Sign Language. And so you actually have an opportunity to highlight other aspects. Here in Victoria, for example, City Council opens every weekly session with an art performance. So here we have to consider our priorities. Are we prioritizing art, Indigenous reconciliation, or religion? And I think when we're talking about what we want to highlight in that public space, I would clearly stand on the side of art and culture before religion, insofar as they seem to be less exclusionary. Now, I also do recognize that if you're opening with slam poets, that may also cause some other problems. And just one other thing to mention, just building on Solange's comments, is you have this interesting question of, okay, so let's say we have a moment of silent reflection, which is quite common in Quebec. But one of the articles I read, which was quite fascinating, said, not all silence is the same. Christian silence is different than Buddhist silence, right? And I've always had this idea, if you have a moment of silence and someone's checking their phone, someone's doing their laundry list in their head, someone else is reviewing their speech, someone's praying to God, we don't know what they're doing. But that silence is meaningful to people in different ways. So I think I recognize the idea of having like solemnizing elements in meetings. And this is also why we saw more prayer in inaugural meetings in municipal councils as opposed to general meetings. But at the same time, we can do so. We can build our own performances. We can build our own rituals, and we have the agency to do that. And I think, when we're talking about the power of tradition, we often don't critically evaluate traditions, and that's one thing we should be doing, and constantly evaluating them. And one of the classic lines I've used describing prayer in the BC legislature is BC used to have a tradition of excluding women from participating, excluding members of the clergy from participating, excluding members of different racial or ethnic backgrounds. And those are not traditions we want to see replicated. And so it's very critical that we evaluate all these traditions in a very critical way to try to improve our systems and make our public forums more welcoming to people. And so, for example, if the BC legislature started with an invocation that was like, all right, so we're all men here gathered together to do manly things and women can leave, that would be abhorrent. And clearly, I don't think we'd be protected by parliamentary privilege even. But it seems like when we do that from a religious context, it seems okay. And that's something we've been trying to challenge. I've talked a lot, and I could talk about this stuff forever, and this is the reason why our reports are so long. And I will say one of the perks of doing NGO reports is we aren't constrained by word limits. So you'll notice, if anybody's interested, by the way, in diving into this more, our data set is publicly available, as are all of the coding that we used. So our House of Prayers report, and Ian put a link to that in the chat, is 138 pages long, and it does have all of the coding. And we really want to invite people to use our data set, because there's so much more that you can interrogate from that data. And I hopefully, like as Solange was mentioning, the idea is we can start exploring this more. And that's why the BC legislature is particularly useful insofar as there are independent, unique prayers delivered each day as opposed to simply a scripted one. So with that, I don't want to take up all the time here. I do like the idea of looking at individual impacts, and that's something we will definitely be exploring. And I will just say on a personal note, that's sort of the impetus behind this whole project. I do Canadian politics as well, and was incensed when I went to a question period in the BC legislature that it started with prayer. And that's when I got in touch with Ian to start this project about 3 years ago. So it does come from a personal place. So we have 5 minutes left in the session here. And I do want to get to Corey's question. So Corey, I didn't know if you wanted to read that, but it's, is there anything that you think contributed to an increase in sectarian prayers by men since 2010? And so I'll put that out to our panel here if anyone had any thoughts.
It is fascinating, and I am not a political scientist or sociologist, as I've said many times, so it's pure speculation. If you look at the makeup of the BC legislature from 2000 to our current time, it actually hasn't changed very much. So I thought maybe, it had something to do with like, maybe the NDP won, a lot fewer seats or something, and because we know that gender is also sort of affiliated with party status in this data set. It may have something to do with so I will say, like, while we saw this increase in sectarian prayer in particular, we didn't see quite the same decrease in secular prayer. And so it could just be the increase in political polarization that's been happening, that if someone was, maybe people are doubling down on religious language use. That's possible. I think there's lots of interesting potential reasons for it, but I don't have a good sense of why. And I'd love to hear from others who have another good idea.
I think my theories around this, like one of the things that's in the data set that I don't think you talked about, Katie, is we saw at least until at least 2017, 2018, fewer and fewer MLAs giving prayers session by session. And I think in 2017 is when the BC Liberals were knocked out of government and we had a minority parliament with the NDP bringing in a lot more young MLAs as well. And so there have been demographic shifts over time, and we've dug through to build a database of the ages and birthdays of MLAs, and it's apparently very difficult to find some people's birthday, even elected politicians, but we're starting to try and build that. And I think there has been a bit of a shift, particularly among those younger MLAs, to be potentially less religious, but at the same time, you still have some deeply entrenched MLAs from more religious areas of the province, kind of maybe clinging to that in a way. I will note, of course, that the MLAs who have given the most prayers, one was Leonard Krogh until he resigned from the legislature to run for mayor of Nanaimo. He gave 11% of prayers in our database, in our data set. It was a prayer a week almost from this man. And following him, it was Ann Kang, who's also a New Democrat. I don't know if there were just fewer New Democrats who wanted to give prayers, and so when they put their hand up, they just got to do it more, but they gave a lot of prayers.
Yeah, we're going to be running our new analysis to see in a post-Leonard Krogh era. I see Lori has a question, so I'll go to her.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for your work. I've used it in my own work, and I really appreciate it. I really appreciate the analytical approach you take to it, the social scientific approach you take to it. I'm curious about a few things. One is the notion of a secular prayer, which is something I have a really hard time with. Another one is thinking about the ways in which prayers, crucifixes, crosses, Sacred Heart statues are defended as our culture and heritage. And this is really tricky territory because, of course, these symbols and practices are precious to some people. And I want to go back to Solange's question. I think she framed it as, what does religious diversity look like? I would take the religious out of that and just say, what does diversity look like? Mm-hmm. And when we live in a multicultural country, what does that mean? How do we honor and respect everyone and let everyone's voice be heard and what's important to everyone be heard? And just one last comment, I know we're short on time. I just have finished a blog piece where I argue that the defense and protection of religion, religious symbols and practices is our culture and heritage. First of all, it leaves out who is us? Who is the us in that? Who is it excluding? And then I actually link it to the murders that happened in London a couple of weeks ago of the Muslim family who were out for a walk. Because until our version of us is expanded to be inclusive, then I think that we will continue to have events like that. So those are just a whole bunch being thrown at you at once, and I'm sorry for that, but it's more because of time. I haven't been able to clearly articulate what I'm thinking about.
I might just jump in here because I was, I read your book on this, and I think it's actually really prescient. You notice the idea of religion becoming culture, so you can defend it as culture and not religion. And within legislatures, you have like tradition and legislative traditions, and then it becomes encultured and therefore defended, not using religious freedoms, but using like cultural freedoms. I think there's two things that are quite interesting here. One is the differentiation between the individual and the state. So, when an individual gets up during their speech and says, I oppose this bill because of Jesus or because of Vishnu or my God, that's slightly different than when the state schedules a session of the Legislative Assembly for prayer exclusively. So we try to draw that distinction between individuals, and Adriana mentioned this as well, individuals acting in their own capacity as well as the state's capacity. And so that's really important, specifically around legislative prayer. If an MLA wants to get up and give a prayer during their debate time, they might have, the whip might have chat with them afterwards. That's a different story than, opening a session with prayer. And I think ultimately the idea of non-religious people being treated as guests in the space is reflected in the fact that even people who gave sort of so-called secular prayers were ending them in amen. And I did want to touch on that because that is one of our challenges with coding was, where do you draw the line? So we have a very detailed coding in our report where we differentiate between these different categories. And the difference between secular and sectarian prayers, and non-sectarian prayers rather, the religious and non-religious divide, was we had to draw the line somewhere, and we ultimately settled on language. So if there was any specific language that we used, like words like the divine, holy, Lord, and we have a whole sort of glossary of terms that were religious terms. But we also recognize that a lot of the secular prayers were thanksgiving. And one of our challenges I had our coders try to do, which was to differentiate the types of prayers, prayers of thanks, prayers of request, prayers of, mourning, and those kinds of things. And ultimately it proved too hard to do because sometimes the prayers do 3 or 4 things at once. So we were trying to use it, breaking it down in linguistic terms. But one thing we also did note was physical, movement. So someone might give a secular prayer that's ultimately a secular invocation or statement. We call them prayers, but they might cross themselves or have their hands in a prayer position, which again evokes religious content. We did have notes like that in our database, but ultimately we didn't analyze them, mostly because our transcribers were not covering all that content. And we just weren't able to capture all that, and the video wasn't always clear. So and I think that's, the idea of religion becoming culture is a longer conversation, but it's one that I've noticed a lot in people who defend these kinds of aspects. And ultimately, I think what diversity looks like is a question we have to consider and be constantly reevaluating in our society. But one of them, I think, is definitely not giving special sessions for one group over another group, in this case, the religious over the non-religious. So I think we're at time here, but if folks have additional questions, we are easy to get in touch with. Please do email us. And one more shameless plug for our book. We are soliciting edited chapters for an edited volume. And so if you're interested in parsing some of these questions out, please do. And our data set's available. Please get in touch if you'd like to analyze it, because there's so much information you can query from it.
Thanks, everyone.